Hello, welcome. And I'm sure for some of you, welcome back to the National Community Reinvestment Coalition Just Economy Conference and this special session featuring the documentary film Go-Go City, Displacement and Protest in Washington, D.C. My name is Samuel George. I'm with the Bertelsmann Foundation. We're a nonprofit institution here in Washington. I'm also the director of the film that we're going to stream this afternoon. Now, this is a film project we started started back in January of 2020. And if you can stop and imagine to January of 2020, it was a little bit of a different world back then. And there was a whole lot that was about to happen that we hadn't exactly planned for. But we knew we wanted to make a documentary about really what we would consider this violent impact of gentrification in Washington, D.C., and specifically looking at it through the lenses of housing, an impact on small businesses, and an impact on culture, and how those three elements kind of feed off each other and reinforced each other. Now, as I said, and in the title, this is a film that takes place is about Washington, but we know that gentrification is a major issue in a number of cities across the country and really around the world as well. As you will see in the film, NCRC was extremely helpful to me on this project, both in terms of giving background and research and advice, as well as sharing their time for interviews for this project. So, I know we don't have a lot of time with this session, so I want to get right into starting to film. It's a slightly edited version of the film. We cut it down. It's about 40 minutes in duration, and that was done to leave time for a post-film discussion that we're all really looking forward to. So after the film, I'll be back here with Ibijoke Akimbowale, the Director of Housing and Counseling Network at NCRC. We'll have Jason Richardson, the Director of Research and Evaluation, also at NCRC, both of whom appear in the film, as well as Dr. Sabia Prince, an anthropologist and artist who is in the film as well. And there will be room for you, audience members, to be a part of this conversation. Please feel free to write in your questions. There's a comment section, a chat function in the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and we will definitely be keeping our eye out for your comments and to work those into the conversation that we're looking forward to. So with that, it's my pleasure to present the film, Go-Go City, Displacement and Protest in Washington, D.C., and we look forward to seeing you on the other side.
I heard they used to put death to people like me. Even if people like me were minding their business, strolling down the wrong dirt road behind some abandoned farm, we were hung by our necks, cut by our skin, beat with shotgun butts and old yardsticks, and if we were lucky, if our mouths functioned long enough, our half-dead screams would pierce through the wind that hugged the night as our minds tried to fight off the fire that our bodies consumed, but couldn't fully endure these flames that were put to us. It's like for centuries they've been lying. For centuries we've been dying. For centuries I've been trying not to let this be the reason I hate, but my blood burns. Every time I write a slave poem, my paper bleeds. They wrote us out our story. Who knew we came from glory? I was blind and my mind was defined by the lies they designed and put out before me. So just sit back and listen. This is a new resistance.
Politics has nothing to do with my city, for real. Capitol Hill, the White House and all that. We have so much more to give. We have our own music, we have our own culture, food. That's what it was, and it'll always be Chocolate City.
They call it gentrification.
They call it progress. That you get to progress that we can be a part of.
I call it cultural genocide.
A lot of the people who filled the street, a lot of those people don't live here anymore.
The people were not showing up a year or 2 years ago, not because they didn't care, but because they believed that they had already lost.
These protests were reasons for people to come back.
And let me hear you say power to the people.
Power to the people.
Power to the people.
I'm here for you. I'm here for your kids, your grandkids.
You can take a lot of stuff away from us. You're not gonna take the go-go.
You can't mute us, man. Never will they be able to mute us. Never, ever.
On this Memorial Day, as the COVID-19 death toll climbs closer to 100,000.
More states now have an upward trend in cases than downward. Is it fair to say this crisis is far from over?
D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser had hoped to announce tomorrow that phase 1 would be happening on Friday. They're not seeing the numbers trend the way they want to, so now the reopening of D.C. is in jeopardy.
Just those very comorbidities that are unfortunately disproportionately prevalent in the African American population.
Put your hands behind your back then. I'm not gonna do nothing. Face in the floor. Stand up. Please, man.
Growing up in Washington, D.C. and being from the neighborhoods I grew up in, you get immune to things. But to see him like crying for his life and he take his last breath.
Yeah, on the ground. On the ground.
Just watching other officers stand beside him. It brought me to tears, and it's still happening to this day, 2020.
I cannot breathe. I cannot breathe.
DC is this place where African Americans have tremendous opportunity. African Americans, after the end of slavery, headed to the cities. Life was freer there. It wasn't free, but it was freer there. And it just so happened that one of those southern cities where the pullback from Reconstruction after the Civil War was perhaps the least violent and the least disruptive to African Americans.
They found work in housing and urban development and different, branches of the federal government.
It was a magnet for African Americans who honestly thought that if I'm going to work hard and accumulate money, there's a higher likelihood in Washington, D.C. that it will not be taken from me through force or through law.
My husband Ben and I opened Ben's Chili Bowl in Washington, D.C. on August 22nd, 1958. This was still a segregated city. When we met and fell madly in love and wanted to be married, he talked about wanting to be self-employed and perhaps opening a restaurant. So he had this special chili recipe that he thought would be great on hot dogs. We talked about that and we decided all we needed was the ideal location. The ideal location was what we called Black Broadway. That's U Street. It was an entertainment center for African Americans. The good thing was we were able to find the architect, the contractor, the plumber, the electrician, and the cabinet maker. All minority-owned businesses within 2-3 blocks of here.
It was Chocolate City in terms of businesses, home ownerships. They thrived within the city.
We had black pharmacists, we had black doctors, we had black banks, savings and loans institutions. That gave me a sense of who I was.
All you had to do was work hard. If you was a businessman, if you worked hard, you can get whatever you wanted in this city. If you was a government worker, if you work hard, you can get whatever you wanted. If you was a street vendor, if you work hard, you can get whatever you wanted.
It was possible to survive on a working class salary here for a long time. In fact, my mother passed away when I was young, and my dad was able to raise both me and my brother. He had a high school diploma. He worked as a clerk at the hospital, but we rented a house. It wasn't in the fanciest neighborhood. We didn't have a lot of luxuries, but we had everything we needed.
People all over the world and all over the country looked at DC as a special way because they felt like we had a sense of pride and we had an ego that we were proud to be black. We were proud to have our own music. We were proud to create jobs and have contracts for people of color where when you go to different places, they were like, how does that happen? That doesn't happen in my backyard.
It was a black-run city as well. Back in the 1960s, that was not very common.
You start to see very early Black Power activists cropping up in DC. You have a large number of lunch counter sit-ins starting as early as 1943 during the Second World War.
Then you had the Black Panther movement, you know, which was like they had us headquarters right across from where I used to live, and we would go over there in the morning before school and they would feed us breakfast and stuff like that.
Dr. King had a satellite office at 14th and U, so whenever he came to town, he'd come into the Chili Bowl as well, and I'd have an opportunity to sit with him for a couple of minutes to hear about his dream.
By the time we get to the late 1960s, DC is easily rivaling places like Newark and Chicago and New York as a center of Black Power activism in the country.
The struggle is eternal. The only thing that will make the power act is when those on the margins become a disruptive force that will not surrender until full freedom and full humanity is granted.
No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace! No 12! 12! How can you defend a system that works against their own people on purpose? If you were a rock before you were a cop. At least it's a fist up, but you won't. But you won't. Please take in yourself for Trump. Let's go!
As Dr. King stated decades ago, protest is nothing but the physical manifestation of failed government policy. The masses are on the move because they become beyond sick and tired of being sick and tired.
People are dying out here. And y'all will stand back here and protect Trump. You all should be ashamed of yourself, especially you. I will spit on you. Wait till I see you outside that badge. Remember the paper. I hope you're ready for a long night.
I mean, go-go music, to me, means DC. Go-go is black culture in DC. It's a product of Chocolate City. That's the foundation for a lot of our upbringing. It's in the DNA, you know what I mean? Jazz culture, you think of New Orleans. Juke music culture, you think of Chicago. You could think of a whole lifestyle surrounding that, how people dress, how people talk, you know, where people like to go and eat. It's all cultural, you understand? So go-go to me is the culture of DC.
Started back playing go-go in '78. Go-go back then was more of an atmosphere. It's like, hey man, where you going tonight? I'm going to the go-go to see Chuck Brown and the Soul Searchers.
I mean, man, go-go meant everything to me because it meant everything to my mother. I remember my mother being in a room and shutting the door and just blasting Trouble Funk and EU in her room. Those were the bands she always played. Of course, I was gonna be just like her.
The basketball court right on 14th and Irving, they used to have all the bands on like Saturday afternoons, the bands that play, and we'll just be out there on our bikes and climbing on the fence in the basketball court, watching the bands play. So I knew that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to play in a go-go band.
It's what people in generations have heard for years and years and years. It makes you proud to say, yeah, this is our music.
Growing up, I always wanted to be one of the guys that Big G shouted out from the stage, you know, oh, Rob White. But I wasn't a popular guy like that. I didn't roll with any crews.
My grandparents were very strict. I lived with them most of the time. So I just had to sneak out the house and go to the go-go's.
The first time that I snuck into a go-go, I was in junior high school, 14, 15 years old. My friends were a decent bit older than me. And I remember walking in, and one of my neighbors who, I knew from the neighborhood but didn't know him well, he saw me at the door and just kind of gave me a puzzled look, and I just said like that.
There was something that Chuck Brown created to go with the atmosphere called a go-go beat.
It started out as a conga-driven sound, where the congos and timbales and the drums was the dominant force.
All of us in classrooms were always banged on our desks, you know what I'm saying?
And you just hold that there, you know what I'm saying? You hold it, and you got the congos with them.
The beat moves. So when you're moving and you're grooving, you bobbing your head.
And then you got the cowbell out there. Ding, 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 ding.
It actually pulls you in.
And it's grooving. Everybody's grooving, and
I can't even describe the feeling. Seriously, it's unreal. We ain't take no fenders. You got 100% cranking. Nothing like it, man.
I'm telling you, they just have a ball. We'll let them dance, and then they just party. They start dropping it low.
Oh man, crank means everybody just having fun, man. When you see a band that's cranking, you can look at the whole entire band and everybody smiling.
You just see that grit come across their face. The drummer all up into it like this. And the cargo plays, just getting it.
That's the pocket right there.
that was the real magic of go-go. That's why they call it go-go. Just keep going and going and going.
We was playing for like 2 hours straight without stopping.
Just that beat going, and people were loving it.
There's nothing like saying you created something. It's like it's in your blood. It's in your DNA.
DC was known historically as the chocolate city, but increasingly over the years, we're noticing that the African American population is getting pushed further and further out.
For me, the definition of gentrification is what happens in urban areas that have been marginalized and neglected over a significant period of time. And then you have a shift where real estate speculation occurs and people take an interest in this community and an influx of resources begin to get poured into that community, followed by the people who have access to those resources.
Look, the city used to be 73% African American. It's now 46% African American. That's a very fundamental change. There's a clearly worn strategy. You take these places that are very poor, you buy cheap, you kick all the poor people out, you fix it up, you move what we used to call yuppies or young professionals in.
Especially following 9/11, you saw a lot of investment in DC as federal spending increased that brought in a lot of new people, and at the same time you had a city that was eager to attract development.
You have to hold the policy makers accountable. DC really went broke and had to figure out a way to increase our tax revenues. Increasing the average salary of residents here or attracting people with higher salaries was a deliberate policy decision. And we did need more tax revenue because we have so many people with high needs in the city. But you also have to be very conscious of the fact that attracting people with higher incomes will start to put a downward pressure on people with more limited incomes. And so you have to create some stopgap and some safety nets to help those people. And that's, I think, where we fell short. One kind of backlash is that you will start to have sort of a domino effect. And next thing you know, neighborhood after neighborhood after neighborhood has become out of the price range for so many African Americans.
It pushed out indigenous Washingtonians. It changed the culture to the point where the Shaw doesn't look like the Shaw that I remember. It doesn't look like the LaJoy Park that I remember. Petworth doesn't look like the Petworth I remember.
You got buildings that's just coming up out of nowhere. But with these buildings, you have a lot of homes that's been taken away from people that's been living in these neighborhoods for over 30 years. You go from paying $875 or maybe $1,300 to somebody telling you, oh, well, this is gonna cost $2,750. What? I was just paying, you know what I'm saying, barely $800.
I don't think anybody's arguing that economic investment is bad, but do the incumbent residents have the option to stay and get all the benefits from that investment, or are they being pushed out and replaced by incoming residents who are going to take advantage of all of that? And it looks like in most areas we're seeing the former.
We are on U Street, the historic U Street. How you doing? Oh, thank you, brother. Known as Black Broadway, the heart of Chocolate City. This was an area that was perhaps like 80% African American, if not more, and it's currently hovering below 40. People have accused developers of taking on the names of local celebrities. That is a condo using the name of DC native Duke Ellington. These are people that are pioneers in African American culture. And these spaces are not necessarily as welcome for African Americans. You're looking up at gleaming condominiums, which are not cheap to purchase or rent. And you're also looking at groupings of African American men that are very unwell, that are very down and out, and that are struggling with addiction. And I just wonder where the resources are for them. And I understand it's not an easy problem to solve, but it's almost like they're invisible. There's a sense that what was here before is completely disposable, that the past doesn't matter, and that the people don't matter. A friend of mine said she was walking behind a woman and her daughter, and they looked up at one of those buildings, and the little girl said something about, oh, Mommy, look at this. And she said, come on, baby, that's not for us.
When we think about gentrification, many folks only think about that as it pertains to home ownership. But that means the loss of business. That means the loss of property. Rents don't just increase for living purposes, but rents have increased at places that have been standardly affordable to do business and have priced folks out.
Came to Washington in 1963.
I've been here ever since.
Who need a sandwich? Who need one sandwich? Anybody need a sandwich? Fish sandwich? Yeah, a sandwich. They want to get more. You come in, everybody else go want to come in.
Which class?
What we got back?
The line is out of line.
Still ain't ready yet?
We'll send a waiter out to tell you your table's ready.
I've been coming in this line since I was a little girl.
This is my grandfather's spot.
I remember standing in line with my father, man. He bought one sandwich. Me and two brothers eating it, man.
I've been in here in and out since I was a little kid. It helped me keep myself out of trouble, gave me something to do. So I appreciate it. And I know the people appreciate it because it's good food. They get their bang for their buck, baby.
All right, my baby. No problem.
Can't remember the guy. All right.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Y'all be good.
They call it gentrification. I call it cultural genocide. Put yourself in a 6, 7, or 8-year-old child's place. You know, they very seldom get a chance to go on a black business and see how it functions.
How you doing? One sandwich?
Thank you.
You're welcome. What we got? Before you had a variety of stores. You had clothing stores, supermarkets, nightclub, hardware stores, women's clothing, men's clothing.
Thanks, sir. I appreciate you.
Ain't no more potato salad.
Ain't no sides at all but fish.
Fish only. Stand right there.
I mean, going up and down H Street, it used to be riddled with local faces that live in the communities and also work and employ others in the community as well.
Anybody else just want fish by itself? How many?
Dickie gave me the chance of a lifetime to be something more than I thought I was.
I need pork.
He taught me how to want to run my own business, being a manager, to have the love for the customers like they had for him. Dickie has my loyalty for the rest of my life.
So ain't no more ketchup? Nowhere. Give me the mumbo sauce, please.
Now you got Whole Foods and Walmart.
Tequila bar,
Canning salon,
Starbucks,
smoothie shacks,
$5 donut shop.
So you make a business decision, you have to live with it.
So where can we get fish from now?
No, right there off of Andrews Air Force Base.
In Maryland?
I'm gonna get a bus out. I'm gonna get a bus out there.
That's too far.
Yeah, it's too far.
It is. It feeds an overall sense of alienation to see these landmark businesses kind of disappear, right? Because people like to eat the kind of food that's associated with their culture. If you no longer have access to that, then that's a loss.
Yeah, we closed.
We sorry, we closed, sir. Bye-bye. Have a good night. Oh,
Close.
ain't no more fish.
No more fish. Close.
You want fish? 5601 Allentown Road.
You know, if you look at the centers of gentrification in the city today, they are the centers of the revolt in 1968.
Someone just rushed into the door that evening and said, Dr. King has been shot. Well, of course we don't believe that. Not our beloved, nonviolent leader. Couldn't possibly be.
After Dr. King was assassinated, you had uprisings, and they occurred in a number of key corridors, the H Street corridor being one in Northeast, the U Street corridor in the historic Black area.
Sadness turned to frustration, the frustration to anger, and the uprising began. Riots took place.
It is tremendously destructive, tremendous fire damage, on all of the business corridors.
I can remember just being afraid because I was about 9 years old then. I remember the smell of smoke, I remember the tanks, and I just remember that sense of danger and unsurety. But to see a person cut down in that way, the pent-up anger, the grief, which people may not know how to express or how to channel that energy. And you also have to put it in context of all the other people that had been assassinated leading up to that. The Medgar Evers and the Malcolm X's and the so many others. This is all a part of the context of what happens when people are disenfranchised and pushed to the side.
After it was over, the businesses didn't reopen.
It destroyed a significant amount of property, and it also demonized that community as a community that you cannot invest in.
The federal government, city government simply did not reinvest. The people who were left were disproportionately poor, and what you had was a sort of investment desert where money just did not come in for a solid another 30 years until young white people began to return to these neighborhoods about 40 years later.
Should we relive the past, make it last? Why can't we see what will be, will be?
That corner is a touchstone. That's how I know that I'm in the Chocolate City. With all of the widespread gentrification, whitewashing, whatever else was happening, you know it was still Chocolate City because you can still hear that music on that corner of that store.
DC has maybe 3 or 4 venues that we can perform in now, where 20, 30 years ago, there had to be 20 or 30 venues.
It's frustrating because, you know, you can't go back there and visit. There's nothing there, or the whole community is changed. It's gone. If you would go down there, you would never see it. But I know it was what was there.
U Street and Florida Avenue and Georgia Avenue is filled with clubs, but unfortunately, it's not accessible to the go-go bands.
They definitely tried to mute go-go. There was a big deal about the music that they've been playing like for years over here off of Florida Avenue. It's a little metro place, and the guy sells all kinds of go-go music. That's like another staple of DC.
I'm Donald Campbell. I've been here at this store since June of 1995. What I wanted to do, I wanted to keep our music alive, so I would play music outside every day. And it would only be local go-go artists.
Top 5 and go-go right now. For y'all that don't know, hey, Chubbs, Jay, shit.
People who came in that building right there, that beautiful building, basically felt like our music was noise. So they tried to stop the music and culture in the expense of the people, right? So we became collateral damage of people who thought they were entitled to come and stop our culture.
We live from the back of the stove. Broadcasting live 7th and Florida. Y'all know what corner this is.
The store that started the entire Don't Mute DC movement.
They sent the police department out here maybe 100 times. They sent the fire department out here maybe 10 times. They didn't get the results they wanted. So they decided to go over those heads, so they went directly to T-Mobile.
So I didn't want to lose my contract, so I cut the music off.
And it made me mad. You come to DC, Maryland, or Virginia, what we call the DMV, and talk about turning go-go music off, man, you tripping.
I was apoplectic. Honestly, like, this is one of the most violent things that you can do is to silence this corner.
We made U Street. You know, when nobody wanted to be here, we started playing this music and it created a life.
We ended up getting 80,000 signatures from something like 94 countries around the world.
I just saw what happened and I felt compelled to take action. I was talking to my boy, Wayne, and I was like, man, you think we need to do another rally, huh? He was like, yeah. I was like, man, we need to do it tomorrow. He was like, man, yeah. Tell everybody to come out, tell a friend to tell a friend. Next thing you know, everything just started blowing up from there.
You were on fire last night, packed with thousands of people out demonstrating in support of the Don't Mute DC movement.
The street at the go-go with bands was coming out and performing and giving shows that was amazing.
Let's talk about the demonstration.
I didn't even know fully what I was doing or the capacity, you know, how grand it would get.
Talk about the implications and the effects of gentrification in the city.
We're using the go-go music as the glue, and we're creating a platform, which are these rallies, for people to come and have their voices heard and make the spectacle.
I want to take the next 50 seconds to talk about the growing Don't Mute DC movement. Today, organizers went back to where it all started, the Metro PCS store at 7th and Florida.
Organizers say they don't want DC to be muted, and they also don't want its historic African-American neighborhoods to be forgotten.
This go-go music thing is something that we all really treasure. You can take a lot of stuff away from us. You're not gonna take the go-go.
We had all these people respond just like that, and then T-Mobile cut the music back on.
I think it was right then and there when they realized the power of go-go, and that was like a history-changing moment.
It's a small victory of a war that we're trying to win.
You know why? We don't die. We just multiply. You can't stop us. And you know why? We don't die. We just multiply. And you can't stop us. And you know why? And we don't die. We just multiply.
They can't stop us. We too good together. Teamwork made the dream work, none better.
Let me see you put your fists in the sky right now. It's powerful. Give yourselves a hand for coming out here, man. Standing up for black lives. We're gonna march our ass down to 16th Street and we're gonna head to the new Black Lives Matter Plaza. Let me hear you make some noise for the new Black Lives Matter Plaza.
No justice, no peace. George Floyd, no justice, no peace.
Go-go has a power, period. There's power in go-go, period. It's about what you use the power for. As far as actually moving people and getting people engaged, music is the universal language, right? So let's use that as a tool to get a disenfranchised community more active again.
These are all the things, the George Floyd protests, COVID and the disparities, you know, there are all these things in our world that are conspiring to mute Black people. What a part of the rallies have been doing is about using your bodies to make sure that you're there, that you have a physical presence, you're not erased, you're seen and also that you're heard. Placement and displacement is a recurring motif for Black people all over the world. We're always looking for a home. We're looking for somewhere that we can relax, where we don't have to think about being oppressed, thinking about whether somebody's going to shoot you, thinking about being told you're in the wrong place. One of the places is in our music and in our culture and in our rituals. So whatever else might be happening, you're home in that moment. You know, you're right where you should be.
It was a great experience for me to see people, especially with this pandemic we've been in now, to see the people still come out.
I saw Caucasian, Indian, Chinese, man, it blew my mind. And for those people to walk with us, they followed us the whole time, all the way back up. That hit me in a special part of my heart.
This shit for real this time.
We gotta do better, man. We've been on the back burner for years and we still on the back burner. Now we a little bit more hip and we older, so we know what we gotta do and who we gotta touch.
After the first rally, I saw the support and I was like, man, we can't just stop. This is a moment. This is a movement. We gotta keep it going.
Hey, Donald Trump. I want everybody to sing that so Trump can hear. Sing it loud.
Here you have groups of DC residents using the culture to make a place for themselves within DC politics.
Go-Go has definitely been the music of the movement here in DC. They come out to one of these rallies, they feel the energy and electricity. They see the people really for who they are, for real people with real culture and a real history in the city.
Go-Go has always been a way for us to say we're here, we exist, look at us, we're living, we're thriving, we're connecting. We're doing the rituals and the cultural traditions that our ancestors have been doing, for thousands of years. It is music of the movement, but it's not just this movement. It's just our movements as Black people.
Go-Go's not a trick, it's not a game, it's us. The drum was always the power that kept us going. It magnified our voices. It resonates with the people. We just breathing in the spirit of our ancestors and we putting it out through our heart, our soul, and the passion that we have for our city. We have the power if we use it.
Okay, well, welcome back. And thank you very much for joining us
for this special version of Go-Go City Displacement and Protest in Washington, D.C., part of the Just Economy Conference. And it's now my pleasure to bring in our panel. From NCRC, we have Ibijoke Akimbowale, the director of the Housing and Counseling Network, where she focuses on the development of strong and successful housing counseling programs, foreclosure programs, home ownership, financial literacy, and post-purchase programs. Also from NCRC, we have Jason Richardson. He's the Director of Research and Evaluation. He's a geographer by trade, and he's done extensive research on mortgage financing and its impact on people and communities. And finally, we have Dr. Sabia Prince, an anthropologist, an author, an artist, many other things, and someone who has a long personal history with Washington, D.C., and whose voice was absolutely invaluable on this project. So, and again, as a reminder, I see some folks have put some questions and comments in. We invite you to do the same. That's in the bottom right-hand corner, I believe, of your of the function. I guess we're all getting used to these online formats. And I would love to ask your question. I just want to kick off with one of my own. I just want to give the panel an opportunity to respond to the film. I mean, what was your takeaway from the film? How does it feed into your work? And how can something like this maybe call attention or help motivate people to make changes? And I guess if you want to go there, what kind of changes would you like to see? Ibijoke, maybe we can start with you.
You're muted.
Can still see and hear me. One, I gotta say that it really was a pleasure to participate in this documentary, and as a DC native and also as a housing professional. And so really, for me, the documentary does highlight the ongoing civil unrest, not only in the District of Columbia, but across the country. And it's not as though there hasn't been significant historical inequalities when it comes to housing, from homeownership to fair housing, the access to fair, just, and equitable housing opportunities for all Americans is just something that we really struggle with as a country. And so I know a lot of people had questions around, well, what do the protests have to do, with housing and gentrification? And it's, folks are angry for a reason. And it's not, there's so many factors here when it comes to, the unjust killings that we see happening in the streets all across the country, but also the inequitable access to opportunities when it comes to housing, when it comes to employment, when it comes to the ever-growing food deserts that are in these communities, and banking as well. And so it really does hit home for me. And I thought it was a wonderful depiction of what's happening across the country, and let alone within the nation's capital.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I know from my perspective in making the film, the question was, what is the connection here? And I think the connection is, of course, the initial protest and reaction to the murder of George Floyd stemmed from the systemic racism in policing and interfacing with criminal justice. But I think it really began to expand beyond that. And people started to talk much more about where we see that systemic racism in other elements of day-to-day life. And that can be very different depending on the city. And I think one way in this particular city in which it manifests itself is in the housing practices and what's become this gentrification. So I appreciate you making that point. Jason, do you think about the work that you've done in terms of your research? You've done and not you personally, you and your team have done an excellent job of quantifying this. I think you're behind some of the very famous studies that have called attention to just how strong of an impact gentrification has had on Washington, D.C. What's your initial kind of feedback to the film? And do you think it kind of bolsters or falls in line with what you see when you look at the numbers?
Yeah, the challenge with measuring gentrification is that in a lot of ways it's a subjective process, right? You know, people view gentrification, they feel it, and although I'm proud of our work, and you can look at NCRC's website and see a lot of great work on gentrification, where we measured, for example, the displacement of over 20,000 Black residents from Washington D.C. in the study period from 2000 to 2010, for example. Those are things we can quantify, but the film really picks up on the things we can't quantify, the feeling that people get. And the one part of this film that always kind of gives me a little, it makes me stop a little bit every time I hear it, is where somebody's mother said to them, "This isn't for you." Sabia, that was your part there. This isn't for you. And that feeling of here is a development coming in, and it may be a new store, it may be new housing, it may be who knows what, into a community that should be a sign of economic progress and investment, but it's made clear either semiotically or in other ways that it is not for the incumbent population. It is for these new people who are coming in, and in DC that's almost always going to be white versus black, right? So I think that's the part that really struck me about this, is that the film does a really good job at putting kind of a human context, whereas my work is always much drier and more quantitative. So I think it's valuable to have both.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. It's always great to kind of package it together on both sides. And I also agree with you with the power of that quote from Dr. Prince about, this isn't for us. And that's in reference to buildings on, 14th and U, which used to be epicenter of Chocolate City. So it's very sad to hear that. And as I mentioned, Dr. Prince is somebody that's has a long-standing experience in Washington, D.C., dating back decades. Can you speak a little bit, if you want to respond to the film, but also, as Jason mentioned, how the feeling of the city has changed? I mean, you're probably uniquely qualified to reflect on that.
Sure. Well, first, I have to thank you for making the film. I think that it's just a beautiful work of art, and it captures something really important. And, as a cultural anthropologist, culture is the thing that kind of is the glue to the work that I do. My area is African American history and culture. And so I like to represent that in the work. And I think that's what you did with this film. You captured the culture of personal expression, of cultural expression, musical expression, and also resistance, right? And those are key themes that run through the Black experience. And so thank you and the Bertelsmann Foundation for doing that. I think what's so very important about much of what you did there was, this kind of musical formation. People are asking, what does this have to do with the protests? I mean, it's mobilization, right? I mean, you can't always mobilize people with pretty speeches. You have to meet people where they are. And as Natalie and so many of the people in the documentary kind of expressed so eloquently, Natalie, I think, very beautifully stated, we are here. It's about staking a claim. It's about saying you cannot silence us. You cannot end this culture. And so that is a very, very strong and pertinent way of resisting, right? So of course it has to do with protests. And then you mobilize people, you pass on information, but you're getting people together. People need to release. They need to have a good time. They don't always have to be thinking about the negative and be, oppressed. We can deal with the fact that we have inequality. We can have a good time. We can learn something. We can pass out some information, and we can get ready for the next, mobilization. So I see a connection there. And then, so that's one piece. But then, of course, the next piece is the issue of policy. I mean, that's how we got here. We got here through policy. And I don't know if I'm completely answering your question, but I will just say that one thing that I really appreciate, and I guess at the same time kind of troubles me, is when we start talking about solutions to gentrification, it's always indirect sort of solutions. And I really am very much wedded to direct, deliberate action in addressing the problems associated with gentrification, because we did not get here through indirect means. We got here through very specific policies as well as neglect. So, I know the conversation is going to go to solutions, There's a long list of them, and they need to be direct and specific, tailored to the people that are directly affected, and they need to be at the table when we're having these conversations about where we go next.
Any of them you wish to share? Anything that would be on the top of your wish list for a direct solution?
How much time do we have? I mean, I'll say this. I am a proponent of reparations, plain and simple, in relation not just to enslavement, but also to redlining and all the disenfranchisement and all the asset theft that African Americans and other groups, will focus on African Americans right now, have experienced in this country, right? So as the Brookings study, I like to cite 156 billion stolen from Black people in asset theft. That needs to be addressed. That will mitigate the impacts of gentrification. Gentrification has taken off. The impacts are harsh. Now we can talk about stopping it, a moratorium, and then let's talk about mitigating the impacts, making things right, making things fair. So, yes, myriad forms of reparations. We can talk about that. We can talk about community land trusts, community-based development. Again, making sure that when you're going to have these great, massive development projects or even smaller ones, let's talk about community benefits. Let's look at the impacts. Let's talk about what people need, right? Because there's uneven development. So everybody doesn't have the same needs. So if we're not talking about that, then we're kind of not grappling with reality here. Don't vote for pro-gentrification politicians. Support, stop tearing down public housing, repair it. It doesn't have to be demolished or build in place. There's so many things that you can do, Sam. And the bottom line is centering people over property and over profits. Yeah. And there's a long list of things related to that. That's where we need to go.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're absolutely right in the sense that this isn't the kind of problem that we can kind of wring our hands at and kind of go around the edges of, that you have to take policy steps that are direct and can really have an impact. So, this is a session that's supposed to wrap up at 5. I'm going to go ahead and take it just a couple extra minutes. Don't worry, not too long. But if anybody wants to hang around with us, maybe 5-6 more minutes, because I feel like we're just kind of warming up. And Sabia alluded to a question that came in from Dr. David Hester, and I would very much appreciate your kind words about the joy in the film. I mean, that was the culture of the city. I mean, that's what we're trying to highlight, in the history and the interplay of that. And the question is, what purpose does the music, in Dr. Hester's examples, it could be go-go, it could be hip-hop, it could be in house, that often seems to come up. It's funny, we actually presented this for a European audience recently, and they talked about how in the 70s and 80s, music was a major part of protest movement there when the Berlin Wall was coming down. What is the relationship do you see in music and protest? I would say Jason.
Sure, happy to chime in here. Well, I just have to quickly comment on Sabia's points about the policies. I absolutely agree. In terms of policy making, we've got to give a thing a name. If we're talking about making policies for Black Americans, we have to specifically advance and support policies that are for Black Americans. And some of that would include special purpose credit programs, supporting down payment assistance, and additional goals towards homeownership and financial security for Blacks. But to your point in question, what makes a city? And I would say that's culture. And go-go is as DC as cheese is to Wisconsin. And so, but music specifically, of course, the arts have always been important to any protest, to any movement, to any community that has been disenfranchised and faces and deals with oppression. And so, I mean, it captivates me to see these bands going down Black Lives Matter a street in DC and saying, don't mute DC, and hands up, don't shoot, and screaming George Floyd's name and Breonna Taylor. I mean, I myself participated in quite a few of those protests. And so it was invigorating. It was empowering. We all left there with conversation and additional movements to make. just as others have experienced with Childish Gambino's This Is America. I mean, I resonate with that music so heavily. It's a way of reaching the masses and capturing the sentiment of the communities. I will also say what coincided with the Don't Mute DC movement actually had been in the neighboring Shaw community. A number of gentrifiers were complaining about not being able to use the Howard University's yard as a space to walk dogs. Yep. And so you've got to take into consideration, I would say, the importance of a native culture and the shock that a community experiences. I mean, as Jason and his team's research showed, over 20,000 people have been displaced just in the last, I believe, 10 years or so. That's significant. We feel the impact of that. What represents us? How do we keep our culture thriving and alive? And music is always a way to do that.
And keep in mind, that's that 20,000 figure was probably a minimum. It's just what we could measure. The question about music is interesting, and your mention about Berlin's interesting because music gives people a way to focus their energy all at one place at one time if it connects people. So, the Berlin Wall, you had Springsteen, you had Pink Floyd, and you had the Scorpions, right? They were all playing concerts around that time that drew huge crowds to the area, and you got that here too. I mean, I think that crosses generations and cultures pretty effectively. That music has that power to bring people together.
That's true. And when you put all of this within a broader context of the African American experience, what you're seeing is, a population that has had their culture attacked perpetually for centuries, right? I mean, starting from the very beginning when ancestors were, loaded onto ships, they were deprived of their languages, they were deprived of their hairstyles, and during enslavement, there were so many things that people were denied, recognizing that a population's culture is their strength. It is a solace, right? It is a area, a comfort place to come together, to celebrate. And another part of our culture and our experience has been fighting to be recognized as human beings, right? So, I mean, there's a historical trajectory here. You're going to tell people that they cannot have their way of life, they cannot celebrate in the way that they have done as a communal way of coming together and relishing the culture. I mean, relishing isn't the right word, but I think that's a big part of what we're looking at here. It's the manufacturing of invisibility and irrelevance, and Black people have always pushed back against that, and we will continue to do so. You cannot silence people, and you save the people and you save the culture. These things work together, right? So, and hey, Black culture is something that the whole world has enjoyed, right? And America has, taken it as their own. So, it's not going anywhere, and people are just going to continue to resist and fight.
Yeah.
Sam, there's a question in the chat I kind of wanted to address. For
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And actually, there's a couple that came in after that. But Celia asked a great question. But what are your thoughts about low to no down payment home loans for low and moderate income Black renters who have consistent rental payment history? So low and moderate income would mean that they make 80% or less of the area median family income. Just a couple of things, Celia, I think those are, there's absolutely a need for this stuff, but you run into a problem in DC with it, where low to moderate income in the DC area is about $100,000 a year. So and Ibejoke probably has a point on this also. So, that may not be the most useful definition for, in DC, I think the Black family median income is around $38,000 a year, I think. So your challenges here are exponentially greater than I think just a lending program, where you've got an extremely high level of income inequality, and there simply isn't the housing. I mean, if your income is $35,000 a year, you're not buying a house in DC. It doesn't matter what kind of loan program you get. So I think we need to, I don't know, Ibejoke, what do you think?
Yeah, so just to set the stage a little bit, the AMI for DC is about $126,000. Let's talk wards 7 and 8 specifically. Both wards have a concentration of over 90% African American. The average income for Ward 7 is $39,000, and for Wards 8, $29,000. In a community and market, again, where we're talking about an AMI of 126,000. And so I think in general, in DC, it is challenging for extremely low income, moderate Black households to advance into home ownership. A significant part about this for minorities in general is the credit box as it exists. The credit box is not inclusive of minorities who are often skeptical about banking institutions, have non-traditional savings, hold higher debt, have less access to capital, also because they haven't had opportunities to do things like create generational wealth through home ownership or through a legacy pipeline of that. And so we've got to be truly innovative when we talk about how do we increase the number of Blacks that are moving into home ownership. And it is not through a standard means that reaches white households, which goes back to that policy-making component. And from a policy perspective, I'll say it's critically important to preserve what you have in the means of affordable housing, because frankly, pre-pandemic, we've been in an affordable housing crisis for quite some time. You got to focus on preserving what you have and how you keep your natives here. And that is by creating policies for people that are indigenous to the communities, for Black and BIPOC communities. And so there's something to be said about policy making that occurs from that lens, but then also policy making that helps people return home. Because it truly, as a native, it's a sad perspective when you want to live where you've grown up, the culture that you know and that you've been embedded into, but you simply can't afford to. And much like what a lot of people have seen, have been, of course, forced into the 9th Ward, or as we refer to it, Prince George's County and other communities, because DC is no longer affordable. And it's not affordable for low income, extremely low income, or a lot of moderate income earning households.
Thank you. You know, there's a question from Joshua that I would like to address here, and that is the impact of COVID on the arts and culture. I think we can even expand that beyond that, just to say, you know, what from your expertise, we have a lot of expertise on the panel, how do you expect the COVID pandemic to impact gentrification and housing in the ways that you study it?
Okay, so I'll quickly just, I'm sorry, Jason.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I just, in terms of the statistics for DC as it pertains to COVID, I believe some 75% of the deaths that have occurred from COVID-19 were Black families. And comparatively, only 26% of Blacks in the district have received a full vaccination or are partially vaccinated, in comparison to over 33% of whites in the community. So the equity question that exists is widespread, and we do see it playing out in terms of COVID as well. That's from a health perspective, and then also around the financial security. One, we talked about how the credit box is not really helpful to minorities at large. And you think about a pandemic, and the average American renter is at least $6,000 behind on their rent. Not to count the over 2.6 million individuals that are in forbearance. And so this pandemic is making home ownership even more unrealistic for a number of communities. And so now is certainly the time to strengthen what we do in terms of the advocacy for this population and the policies. I'm happy to say at least the Biden team is working to support some of the interests here, but I'll turn it over to Jason for more perspective.
Yeah, I kind of have the, so Josh, I've got kind of a more pessimistic view of this, is that, you know, from a property developer's point of view, whether or not you purchase a property and redevelop it and do something with it is strictly a numbers, you know, game, and the input, the cost of purchasing the property is a huge part of that. If we're in a situation where renters are not paying their rent, then for the landlord's point of view, the property owner's point of view, the value of that property is declining for them. And there's an increased chance they'll look to sell it at whatever price they can get for it. There, in places where there is gentrification, which is generally concentrated in the largest 20 metro areas in general, they're the ones that are really seeing the gentrification activity at a large scale. This is going to have property developers taking a look at areas they thought were previously beyond their price range. And it may create a situation where deals make sense for development that didn't make sense pre-pandemic. That's my fear. A lot of this depends on the administration and what kind of support they get to landlords and renters. And this crisis is absolutely a crisis for renters, as opposed to the last housing crisis, which was more focused on the impact to homeowners. I think that this time renters are really going to bear the brunt of it. And unless there is a significant investment in helping renters and landlords, even though we don't like to talk about landlords that way, but without help, they're going to be looking to sell those properties off, and developers will come in and swoop up the most desirable ones that they think they can develop, and it will result in gentrification and displacement.
Well, all right. We're getting really towards the end here. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. There's some folks like Celia Wilson that have had some really nice comments, Dr. Hester, about the film, asking how we can see this film down the road. There's also some questions about me as a filmmaker. I think that that's a fine conversation that I'd be happy to pursue, bilaterally. Please reach out to me. I'm happy to talk about the process. And in terms of sharing the films down the line, our films are always available for free. We've had some success with this film, and we've really enjoyed doing these kind of public-private public screenings, but they're not online. Soon enough, the film will be online and available for folks to watch whenever they want. You can follow at Bertelsmann Foundation to see information on future screenings in the film, and we definitely hope it can get shared and passed around. So I thank you for that, but I want to leave the end of this conversation. I want to give our panel a chance to really focus their work and where they're going moving forward. And I'll just kick that off with an observation that I've had that I've discussed with all three of you. And that's this notion that I'm afraid I see this dichotomy in the United States of certain cities that are facing this extreme gentrification pressure, and that gets mirrored in other cities that are getting the opposite. They're facing this kind of persistent underinvestment and lacking the resources. And I don't think anybody really wins in that kind of scenario. So there's my observation. You guys are the academics and the experts on this topic. Where do you see us moving forward from here, and how can we get back on a track that's going to be more working for middle-class Americans?
I think that's an interesting question, Sam, and it's going to depend on a number of factors, right? I mean, nothing happens without the push. So everything that we have, I'm thinking now, I have to, you frame this documentary with the George Floyd murder, and 2 words, videotapes and protests, right? So that's what we have to do. And that's what people have been doing, and they're going to have to continue doing so. Organizing. I worked for a grassroots organizing entity, Empower DC, and that is very hard work, mobilizing people. It's different from activism, right? I've been an activist for a long time, but mobilizing people is a whole other ball game, and it needs to happen. It needs to be intensified, and we need resources for that. That's very difficult work. It's not very well remunerated. And it's very stressful, but it's necessary. And, I'd like to see more of that, more mobilizing, more teaching, more civil disobedience, right? We just cannot take no for an answer. It's entirely too much vulnerability and entirely too much suffering, and it's not sustainable. So I see more mobilizing in our future. And with younger people at the table, we will continue to adjust the strategies, right? So that they're inclusive and that we can constantly work at being heard and being seen.
Thank you so much. Ibijoke, maybe we can bring you in. I see there's a comment that's directed to you. Let's see if it comes with a question.
Sure. And while you find that, I would just say, that to me, home ownership and Black home ownership specifically is a form of activism. And we have the responsibility to live out the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and those civil rights pioneers that worked so hard that we would have the Fair Housing Rights Act that would be more inclusive of creating, again, equitable access, well, equal access to housing opportunities for all persons. But we know equal and equity are two different things, and we need more equity in order to be able to move the needle in the right direction. I agree with Sabia that that definitely comes from mobilization, and also from, for those local community groups on the line, elevating what is working in your communities and what's not working to the highest level, to your national partners, like here at the team at NCRC, to your members of Congress. These public servants work for you, they work for your communities. We have to elevate and tell them what we need, vote them out when they're not doing what the communities needs, and hold these folks accountable so that we can have more equity in this country around housing issues and justice.
Jason, maybe we can come to you for a final word.
Real quick, I know we're over time, but you know, Celia Wilson in the chat mentioned that she was in Cleveland, and I think that's a good example here of the other side. You know, in Ohio, cities are typically struggling more with underinvestment and disinvestment. What we found, and what also other gentrification researchers have corroborated, is that generally gentrification is concentrated amongst a handful of economically vibrant large cities. So DC, Denver, Boston, San Francisco, I think those are in the top 5 typically. I don't have the whole like top 10, top 20 list in my head, but in other cities, you know, you might feel that an area is gentrifying, and it may be at a small scale, but overwhelmingly the problem is disinvestment. So for a community organization like NCRC that's focused on community investment, you know, that we have to be, you know, cautious here. We want to talk about gentrification, but disinvestment is overwhelmingly impacting a larger number of people and larger number of cities. So you don't want to have the conversation about just one or the other. They're both important. They're two halves of the same coin, and they need to be, you know, considered and treated independently, I think.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. You know, we really appreciate everybody for tuning in, for everybody who hung on as we went a little bit over time. Our panelists, Jason Richardson and Ibijoke Akimbowale of NCRC, Dr. Sabia Prince. You know, if I were to be permitted a final editorializing, I would simply say what a beautiful and unique culture and city, you know, the traditional Washington, D.C. was, and how much we miss when we lose that. I mean, it's really a global gem. And it's been an absolute pleasure for me through this film and through living here for 10 years to get to know it. If you're relatively new to the city, I say it's not going to fix a lot of the problems, but make an effort to get to know where you live. It won't just help other people. You will feel more understanding of your surrounding. So thank you very much. This is, again, the National Community Reinvestment Coalition Just Economy Conference. There's going to be a lot of content online. There's already a lot of content online, and there's a couple more days of this conference. And like I mentioned, folks listening out there can feel free to follow up with me to talk about this documentary and other documentaries. And everybody, have a wonderful day, and thank you for joining us.